In this tutorial, we're going to have a practical look at how to write some functions in Java. And so to begin, we need to figure out what it is that we want the function to do. So imagine that we want a function that can count between a certain set of numbers. Let's say we can give a starting number and an ending number, and then the function can print those numbers to the screen. So for example, if I passed a 1 and a 10, then the function would print out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So what might this look like? Well, in a previous lecture, I had talked about the template or the mantra for writing functions. And you know that anytime you have to write a function, it's always going to be the return type, the function name, and then any parameters that the function might need. So let's go ahead and start to stub that in. So I can come up here, and let's talk about the return type. So because this thing is just printing numbers to the screen, it's not going to return me any kind of result. That doesn't make sense. And the temptation with new programmers is that they would think that it's going to return a string, and that's not necessarily the case. So we know that the return type is going to be void in this case. All right, now we move on to the function name, and it can be anything that we want it to be. And because it's going to print numbers to the screen, let's just call it print numbers. Okay, in fact, let's just go ahead and stub out the rest of this here. I have my opening and closing parentheses and my opening and closing curly braces. And so technically this is a function, and it compiles, and we could run it and everything else even though it doesn't do anything. All right, so looking at the parameters, this is the hard part because it involves a little bit of design, and so there's no hard and fast rules on how you set this up. But it does make sense because we'd like to be able to give it a starting and an ending number for it to count between, that we would have those things as parameters. So let's go ahead and put these things in. I could say int start and int end, and there you go. And a lot of times this chunk right here, I'm going to highlight it. This is called the function prototype, right? So it's just the return type, the function name, and the parameters. And depending on the language you're working in, they're going to refer to the function prototype quite often. Okay, and then notice here's the beginning of the function and here's the end of the function. Now as a review, remember that we can have code that's kind of scattered all over the place. Here we're putting the function right above main, but these could actually be located in another file or even remotely on some other machine. But for now, let's keep it relatively simple. Now, because we want to keep it simple, it's important for us to include the word static here, right before our return type variable, our function name, and then parameters. And the reason is because we're kind of breaking some object-oriented rules. And so that's okay for now. We're just practicing our function writing. Okay, so now what are we going to do on the inside of print numbers? Well, you might imagine that we're going to have some kind of loop, because start and end can be any arbitrary numbers. They can be positive, they can be negative, and we'll assume that start is going to be less than end for simplicity's sake. All right, so what kind of loop would be good for us to use? Well, because we know a starting and an ending position, I'm going to use a for loop here. So let's stub in a for loop. I could say for int I gets, and you might be tempted to say 0, but remember that we want to use the variable start here. So our counter I is going to be initialized to the value of start. And so long as I is less than or equal to end, then we could say I++. Now what are we going to do on the inside? We can just system.out.print I plus a space. Okay? And then usually it's a good idea after this function has run, or at least this loop has run between lines 5 and 7, that we'll just put a system.out.println so that it drops down to the next line after it's done printing. And I could leave that empty, or I could put in an empty string. It doesn't really matter. Okay, and believe it or not, that is a complete function. Now, it may come as a surprise to some of you that if I run this, and I have to save it first, that if I look, it did terminate correctly, but there is no output. And you may say, why? Well, realize that even though we've defined this function right here, print numbers, we haven't called it. In other words, it's just sitting up there waiting to be called. And again, remember, just as a really fundamental review, that main is the entry point into the program, not all of the functions at the top. What I'm trying to hammer home is that we're going to have a lot of code that's above main, and don't be under the false assumption that that code is going to run first. Okay, so how would we get print numbers to work for us? Well, let's do the easiest version here. So I have to call the function, and I'm going to call it by name. So I'll say print numbers, and notice that I have to pass it a couple of things. It's complaining about print numbers right now because I've called it incorrectly. So if I go up here and I look at the prototype of print numbers, it says, hey, for me to work, you've got to pass me a starting number and an ending number. So I have to pass it exactly two things, and they have to be ints. So let's pass, let's say, a 3 and an 11, and not forget my semicolon. And notice that it recognizes it as being a function. And if I were to run it now and save it, you can see that down here we get the values 3 through 11. So it looks like it works. Okay, let's try a different way that we could call print numbers, and I'll do this without hard coding or passing these literal values here. So instead, what I'll do is I'll create a number. Int num1 gets, let's say, 5. It doesn't really matter. Int num2, let's say, gets 8. And now watch what else I can do. So I could call print numbers, again, reusing that function, and I could pass it num1 and num2. So as a review, look at what's going on here. I know that num1 has the value 5 and that num2 has the value 8. So num1 is going to get copied here into start. Num2's value is going to get copied into end. And as you might imagine, if I were to run this, then you can see our first time that we called print numbers with 3 and 11 still works. And then our second time that we called print numbers is still going to work between these variables 5 and 8. So we can reuse this function any number of times. Okay, let's see if we could create a different kind of function that has a return type. And it's along the same lines. I think you understand what's going on with print numbers. So here's what I'm going to do. Let's say that we want to create a function that can sum up the numbers. So it doesn't just print the numbers. Instead, it's going to sum up the numbers between a starting value and an ending value. So what I'll do for simplicity is just to copy this, and I'll drop it down here, and instead of calling it print numbers, let's call it sum numbers. Okay. So if I'm going to sum up numbers, I'm still going to need a starting and an ending value that I want to sum between. However, this is going to return us some kind of value, so I need to have something that's not void right here. So what do you suppose the return type would be? Instead of it being void, I'm going to have it as an int. Now, notice that we get a red squiggly line, and you may be saying, hey, well, this was a simple change. Why do I get a red squiggly line? Well, anytime you have a non-void return type, remember you have to have a return statement on the inside of that function. So we'll get to that in just a second. How about this? Let's create a variable that's going to hold the result of all the summation that we're doing. So I could say int result. I've got to give it some kind of starting value, so I'll start it out at 0. And then a little bit later on down here, we'll get rid of this print statement because we're not going to be printing anything. I could just say return the result. Now, notice that the red squiggly lines go away because we have actually fulfilled this contract that we're talking about. We promised that we're going to return an int if somebody passes us 2 ints. Okay? So here on the inside, notice that we still have a loop, and that loop goes from a starting to an ending point. So let's kill this line right here. We don't need it. But what am I going to say on the inside? Well, how about this? We could say result plus equals I. So let's think about what's going on here. Result started out the first time as being the value 0. So we've got our counter starts out at the value start, which we can make it anything we want. And what we're doing is we're aggregating. We're taking the old value of result, adding the counter to it, and then copying that back into result. Let me expand this out real quick so you could see. It's the same thing as result gets result plus I. So we take the old value of result, add I to it, and then copy that back in. But I want you to get used to these shortcut operators, so let's just do that. Okay? Now, again, if we were to run it, we'd get the same output that we did last time because we haven't called sum numbers. So here's a common mistake that I see people do. They'll say something like this. They'll say sum numbers, and they'll pass it a 1 and a 5. Now here's the interesting thing. Notice that it doesn't complain about anything. Even though sum numbers does return us a value, it returns us a result, notice that it's not complaining. In fact, if I were to run it, we get the same output we did last time. Now you may be asking what's going on. Remember, sum numbers returns us a result, but what did we do with the result right here? We did nothing. So what I can do is to say int result gets whatever sum numbers is going to return us. Now, be careful here, because notice that we have a variable up here called result, and we have a variable down here called result. These are two totally different variables. Even though they have the same name, this result right here in no way refers to this result here. In other words, remember we talked about local variables and the scope of variables. Who can see this result? Only everything on the inside of some numbers. Who can see this result down here? Only anything referencing stuff down here in main. So they can only be seen within the functions that they're defined in. So to prove that this actually works, we can say system.out.println, and we'll just put result there directly. So what is 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5? Well, if I run it, you're going to see that that gives us the value 15, which is exactly what we expected. So that gives you a couple of practical examples of something that's a little bit more complex than we saw in the previous lecture. And you can see that we've only got maybe 4 or 5 lines of code on the inside. These things will start to grow over time. And as a general rule, usually when you start to exceed 10 or 15 lines of code inside of a function, you may consider breaking that out into even another function and have a function call another function, if that would make sense. So hold off on that for now. I just wanted to give you some practical examples of how these things work, and hopefully that clarified things like parameter passing and getting back results from functions.